I am sorry, Richard, but effective immediately, your position is being eliminated. That is what Clara Higgins, the senior human resources representative, said to me without a single drop of human empathy or professional warmth. No direct eye contact whatsoever. Just relentlessly clicking her cheap plastic ballpoint pen like she was taking attendance at a neighborhood PTA gathering rather than gutting a 56-year-old veteran manager's entire career. Meanwhile, Gavin Thorne, my direct supervisor of 7 grueling years, sat across the polished glass conference table with a bloated, self-satisfied smirk like he had just pulled off the heist of the century and gotten away completely clean. His expensive silk necktie was noticeably crooked, patterned with silly little white sailboats, as if he fancied himself the grand admiral of an ocean yacht. Instead of torpedoing a dedicated senior executive's livelihood exactly 7 days before annual corporate bonuses were distributed. 7 short days, the very same enterprise where I had logged 70-hour work weeks, sacrificed my personal weekends, and bled myself dry to keep nationwide supply chain operations running smoothly while managing my 81-year-old mother, Helen's mounting medical care invoices. I had personally accessed the master bonus allocation spreadsheet 3 days prior. I saw the calculated projections with absolute clarity. I knew beyond a shadow of a doubt that I was scheduled to receive at least $65,000 in earned performance compensation. Money that was already mentally earmarked to settle overdue hospital bills and replace the deteriorating roof on my mother's small bungalow home before harsh winter storms battered it into complete wreckage. But Gavin was implementing what he grandly called strategic corporate restructuring. In his narrow, self-serving mind, restructuring simply meant terminating anyone with an actual professional conscience and a salary package larger than his preferred entry-level assistant's monthly stipends. I stood up slowly from my leather executive chair, my jaw clenched tightly enough to grind my molars into fine powder. No severance package beyond the basic minimum, I asked, keeping my voice unnaturally steady despite the rapid pounding in my chest. Standard separation package, Clara Higgins chirped cheerfully, as if reciting a scripted commercial. 3 weeks of base pay and a neutral employment reference, provided there are no complications, formal grievances, or legal disputes. I grabbed my leather briefcase with fingers that felt as cold and rigid as ice. Oh, I would not dream of complicating your precious bonus pool distribution, I replied, staring directly into Gavin's smug eyes before turning on my heel. I walked out through the main office floor, my shoulders square, passing open workspaces filled with colleagues who suddenly found party to deep fascination by their computer monitors and shoe fastenings. My office desk, freshly emptied of its authority, waited like an abandoned shrine. I began packing 7 years of my professional life into a plain cardboard container. A framed black and white photograph of my mother from happier years, 3 ceramic coffee mugs, 2 bound operational ledgers, and a stack of color-coded file folders. I did not even glance through the papers, just swept the remnants into the box like a crime scene technician clearing away evidence from a violent burglary. The elevator ride down to the underground parking garage felt like being lowered into a silent subterranean vault. It was not until I arrived home, poured 2 fingers of aged bourbon into a heavy glass tumbler, and sat alone in my quiet study that I remembered the forgotten metal filing cabinet tucked beneath my desk. The bottom locked drawer that I had not opened in years. That was where I found it, buried underneath obsolete hardware manuals and vintage tax receipts. My original employment agreement from 2017, still resting inside its crisp blue legal backing, fully executed with dark ink signatures from the founding leadership team. I unfolded the thick bond paper slowly, reading through the formal clauses as the text blurred and refocused under my desk lamp, and there it was, buried on page 6 under section 12B, right beneath the standard termination guidelines. If the employee is terminated without cause, he shall be entitled to receive 10% of the company's net quarterly profit earned during the quarter of termination in lieu of standard bonus allocation and severance pay. I blinked hard, rubbing my eyes, and read the sentence 3 times to ensure I was not hallucinating. 10%. Not 10% of my operational division's departmental pool, but 10% of Apex Logistics' entire net quarterly earnings across the whole enterprise. I burst out laughing so hard that I nearly spilled my drink onto the carpet. Because here was the absolute beauty of the situation. They believed they were ruthlessly tossing me aside to pocket my $65,000 bonus. But back in 2017, when Apex Logistics was still a hungry mid-sized firm scrambling for market credibility, I had negotiated that specific executive protection clause before agreeing to leave a secure vice presidency elsewhere. The original founder had readily agreed because I was single-handedly bringing in lucrative federal compliance contracts worth millions. Gavin Thorne had never read my founding contract. Of course he had not. Gavin was the type of manager who rarely read anything beyond high-level executive summaries unless his name was highlighted in bold text. And now, according to a binding legal contract signed by the board, they did not owe me $65,000. They owed me a percentage of a quarterly net profit that ran deep into 8 figures. Bright and early the following Monday morning, I walked into the historic downtown law firm of Drake & Associates to meet with veteran attorney Winston Drake. Yelp reviews described Winston as the legal equivalent of a ferocious badger that refused to let go once its teeth sank into an ankle, which suited my current temperament perfectly. The corner office smelled strongly of dark roast coffee and old parchment. Winston was a lean, sharp-eyed man in his early 50s with silvering hair and an unblinking gaze that had clearly terrified opposing corporate lawyers for decades. He did not waste time with pleasantries or unnecessary small talk. He simply gestured for me to sit across from his desk, which was stacked high with legal briefs, leather-bound reporters, and half a dozen yellow legal pads. "So," Winston said, leaning back in his leather chair and running a thumb along the margin of my contract. "Gavin Thorne and Human Resources terminated you 1 week prior to the annual bonus distribution, citing general corporate restructuring without cause." "That is precisely what occurred," I confirmed, folding my hands over my knee. Winston let out a low, appreciative whistle. "This clause in Section 12B is absolute iron. Clear, unambiguous, and fully enforceable in any court of law. 10% of total net quarterly profit upon termination without cause. The company legally committed themselves to this provision when the agreement was executed in 2017. He grinned slightly, revealing sharp teeth, then immediately shifted back to a serious posture. "But here is the reality we must prepare for, Richard. Corporate entities of this magnitude do not hand over multi-million-dollar payouts without a vicious fight. The moment our formal demand letter arrives on their desk, their legal department will attempt to retroactively reclassify your dismissal. They will claim you were let go for cause, citing alleged insubordination, poor performance, or failure to meet strategic organizational goals." My jaw tightened. "Gavin is certainly capable of fabricating whatever narrative protects his bonus," I said. "That is why we must take the offensive immediately," Winston instructed, tapping his pen against a pad. "We need an airtight paper trail establishing your flawless record right up to the hour of your termination. Performance reviews, client commendations, internal emails, quarterly operational metrics, anything that proves you are an invaluable asset. Furthermore, we must establish their underlying financial motive, that your termination was part of an intentional scheme to artificially inflate the executive bonus pool before reporting earnings." Leaving Winston's office, I felt a cold, sharp clarity taking over. The chaotic anger from Friday evening had completely evaporated, replaced by a calculated, methodical resolve. My first objective was clear. I needed an insider within Apex Logistics, someone who had full access to operational records, possessed an unyielding sense of personal integrity, and was equally disgusted by Gavin's management tactics. I reached out to Laura Jenkins, our senior operations manager. We met at a quiet corner table in an unassuming Italian bistro 3 miles from the corporate headquarters. Laura was already seated when I arrived, her fingers nervously tracing the rim of her iced tea glass. The moment I sat down, her eyes flashed with intense irritation. "Richard, the entire floor is furious," she whispered, leaning across the table. "Gavin told everyone during Monday's stand-up meeting that you chose to take early retirement to pursue personal interests. Nobody bought that garbage for a second. We all know he pushed you out right before the annual bonus distribution. I smiled faintly. Gavin's propaganda machine is working overtime, I noted calmly. How is he settling into my old suite? He moved his entire setup in by 9 o'clock this morning, Laura said with a scowl. But more importantly, Richard, you need to know what happened right after you left on Friday afternoon. The executive committee officially closed the Sentinel Defense Logistics contract, the massive national supply chain project your team worked on for 6 straight months. I stared at her in disbelief. The Sentinel Defense contract was signed, I asked. Signed, sealed, and executed, Laura confirmed quietly. It is a $52 million deal with an incredible profit margin. Gavin held back the public announcement so he could roll the entire revenue entry directly into the current third quarter earnings report. It is going to cause the company's net profit numbers for the third quarter to skyrocket to unprecedented levels. And because he eliminated your position, 48 hours before the ink dried, your name was stripped from the commission ledger entirely. The greed was so blatant it was almost breathtaking. They had cut me loose not because I was underperforming, but specifically because I had delivered the single largest revenue windfall in the company's recent history. Gavin wanted that multi-million-dollar profit spike to fund his executive team's payouts without having to share a single dime with the man who actually built the operational infrastructure. Can you secure the internal documentation? I asked Laura directly, looking her straight in the eye. The original project sign-offs, the unedited earnings projections for the third quarter, and the internal correspondence regarding the Sentinel deal. Laura did not hesitate for a second. I already saved duplicate copies to an encrypted external drive from my personal station, she replied firmly. You gave 7 years of your life to this company, Richard. I am not going to sit back and watch Gavin Thorne steal your legacy. An hour later, I delivered the encrypted drive directly to Winston Drake's office. By 4 o'clock that afternoon, Winston had dispatched a formal demand letter via certified courier to Apex Logistics headquarters. The letter formally invoked Section 12B of my 2017 contract, asserting my legal entitlement to 10% of the total net profit for the third quarter following my termination without cause. The fuse was officially lit. The corporate retaliatory response arrived 72 hours later in the form of a thick, intimidating legal packet sent by Sidney Shaw, the senior partner at an elite corporate defense firm representing Apex Logistics. Winston called me into his office to review the documents together. The tone of their letter was predictably combative, denying any financial obligation under Section 12B, and asserting that my employment had been terminated strictly for cause due to documented professional misconduct and persistent subpar performance. Winston flipped through the attached exhibit pages with a practiced eye. They have included 3 formal written reprimands, 2 negative performance evaluations, and a final termination summary, he explained, placing the documents before me on his desk. All of these records explicitly state that you repeatedly engaged in insubordinate conduct, failed to meet core operational metrics, and created a hostile work environment within your division. Furthermore, every single one of these documents bears the signature of your former supervisor, Gavin Thorne. I leaned over the desk and examined the paperwork carefully. The first reprimand was dated June 14th of the current year, claiming I had engaged in an aggressive verbal altercation with Gavin during a regional strategy meeting. I remembered that exact date vividly. On June 14th, I was in Chicago delivering an operational keynote address to 300 industry leaders, an event for which Gavin had sent me a glowing congratulatory email later that evening. The second evaluation claimed I had missed critical project milestones on the Sentinel Defense contract, the very contract I had successfully finalized. None of these notices were ever presented to me, I stated firmly, my fingers tracing the crisp white paper. I never received a copy, never discussed these alleged warnings with human resources, and never signed a single acknowledgement form. Winston pointed his pen at the bottom line of the signature blocks. Notice that your signature line is blank on every single document, with only Gavin's signature applied. They are attempting to construct a retroactive paper trail to legitimize a for-cause dismissal. If these documents were genuinely drafted on the dates listed, they present a significant legal hurdle. But if they were fabricated after your termination, it constitutes flat-out legal fraud. That evening, I contacted Laura Jenkins to investigate the digital origin of the files. As senior operations manager, Laura possessed administrative access to the shared network directories where executive human resource records were archived. 2 hours later, Laura called my personal phone with a tremor of excitement in her voice. "Richard, you will not believe what I just uncovered," she said. "Gavin saved the raw Microsoft Word source files for those reprimands in a hidden folder on his local drive instead of the secure HR repository. I extracted the full metadata properties for all 3 documents." "What do the creation timestamps show?" I asked, holding my breath. "Every single one of those 3 reprimands was created on October 4th at 10:14 in the morning," Laura revealed triumphantly. "Exactly 1 day after they fired you on October 3rd. Gavin sat at his computer the morning after your dismissal and manually generated all 3 fake warnings in a 45-minute typing spree, then backdated the text inside the body to make it look like a months-long disciplinary record." I let out a slow, deliberate breath as the full weight of her discovery sank in. Under state penal statutes, specifically Section 470 regarding document forgery, creating backdated records to fraudulently deprive an individual of legal compensation is a serious criminal offense. Gavin had not just acted unethically, he had committed documented felony forgery in his rush to cover his tracks. Later that night, I received an unexpected encrypted message from another former colleague. Dennis Miller, a senior financial analyst at Apex Logistics who had been abruptly let go 2 weeks prior to my termination. Dennis requested an immediate face-to-face meeting at an all-night diner near the interstate. When I arrived, Dennis looked visibly exhausted, his eyes heavy with dark circles, but his expression was resolute. "Richard, I heard about your demand letter through the office grapevine," Dennis said, sliding a silver USB thumb drive across the Formica table toward me. "They fired me 2 weeks ago because I refused to sign off on fraudulent accounting entries for the 3rd quarter. Gavin and the chief financial officer explicitly instructed me to reclassify deferred service revenues from the Sentinel Defense contract into immediate 3rd quarter earnings to inflate the quarterly profit figures prior to executive bonus calculations." He leaned closer, his voice dropping to a low whisper. When I raised ethical objections and threatened to report the irregularity to the audit committee, they escorted me out of the building under the guise of organizational restructuring. But before they wiped my system credentials, I downloaded the complete unedited financial ledgers, the internal email directives from Gavin ordering the accounting manipulation, and the true quarterly profit calculations. Apex Logistics' actual net profit for the 3rd quarter stands at $52,400,000. I picked up the metallic drive, feeling its cold weight in my palm. Dennis had handed us the final missing piece of the puzzle. We did not merely possess a strong contract claim anymore. We held absolute proof of corporate fraud, executive document forgery, and systemic financial manipulation designed to enrich Gavin Thorne and his inner circle at the expense of loyal employees. Winston Drake reviewed the contents of Dennis Miller's flash drive, and Laura's extracted metadata throughout the night. By sunrise, his legal strategy was fully mapped out. Instead of launching a protracted court battle that could drag on for years, Winston scheduled an emergency executive settlement conference at Apex Logistics corporate headquarters, giving their legal counsel only 24 hours to assemble their leadership team. At 2 o'clock on Thursday afternoon, Winston and I entered the Majestic's 14th floor executive boardroom. The room featured panoramic city views, polished mahogany tables, and an oppressive, chilly atmosphere designed to intimidate visitors. Waiting for us on the opposing side of the table were Chief Executive Officer Preston Halloway, Lead Corporate Counsel Sidney Shaw, and my former supervisor, Gavin Thorne. Gavin sat back in his leather chair with a smug, arrogant posture, adjusting his expensive jacket cuffs and smirking, as though he expected us to grovel for a modest severance handout. CEO Preston Halloway, a stern man in his late 60s with cold gray eyes, opened the meeting with a clipped tone. "Mr. Vance, "We are offering this courtesy meeting to resolve your contractual inquiry quietly," he said smoothly. "Our legal team has already reviewed your claim under Section 12B, and as our counsel has communicated, your termination was conducted strictly for cause based on documented performance failures. Therefore, no profit sharing applies. However, out of goodwill, we are prepared to offer a one-time nuisance settlement of $75,000 in exchange for a complete release of claims." Gavin smiled faintly, leaning forward as if waiting to watch me capitulate. Winston Drake slowly unbuttoned his suit jacket, opened his leather briefcase, and plugged a sleek encrypted drive into the boardroom's high-definition wall presentation display. "We are not here to negotiate a nuisance settlement, Mr. Holloway," Winston declared in a voice that commanded instant attention across the room. "We are here to present the undeniable factual record regarding Mr. Vance's termination and the contractual obligations of Apex Logistics under Section 12B. Winston clicked his remote, illuminating the large display screen with our first piece of evidence. "Let us begin with Exhibit A, the alleged performance reprimand submitted by Mr. Gavin Thorne to justify firing my client for cause," Winston explained calmly. Opposing counsel provided 3 written warnings dated June 14th, August 2nd, and September 19th. However, an independent digital forensic examination of the raw document metadata reveals that all 3 files were authored on October 4th between 10:14 in the morning and 10:59 in the morning. Specifically, the morning after Mr. Vance was terminated on October 3rd. Gavin's smug expression instantly froze, the color draining from his face as the detailed metadata properties appeared on the screen, showing his personal workstation user credentials, the exact creation timestamps, and the original file creation paths. Winston leaned over the mahogany table, looking directly at the CEO. Under State Penal Statute Section 470, generating backdated disciplinary records to fraudulently deny a former employee their contractually obligated compensation constitutes felony document forgery. Sydney Shaw's mouth opened slightly in shock as she frantically scanned her printed copies, then glanced at Gavin with severe alarm. Gavin stammered incoherently, his voice trembling. That is completely ridiculous. Those files were just administrative summary notes compiled from my handwritten drafts." Winston did not pause for a single second. He clicked the remote again, bringing up Exhibit B. "Here we have a sworn affidavit from Mr. Dennis Miller, former senior financial analyst, accompanied by certified internal accounting logs," Winston continued relentlessly. "Prove that Mr. Thorne and your corporate financial department intentionally manipulated the revenue recognition timeline for the $52,400,000 Sentinel defense contract, shifting deferred service fees directly into third-quarter earnings to artificially inflate third-quarter net profits." The display displayed internal email chains explicitly showing Gavin Thorne instructing financial staff to expedite revenue entries while simultaneously terminating senior staff, including Mr. Vance, to slash overhead right before quarterly profit calculations. The total net profit for the third quarter is established at $52,400,000. Under Section 12B of my client's 2017 contract, 10% of that figure equals exactly $5,240,000. The silence in the boardroom was absolute, so dense you could hear the soft humming of the ventilation system. CEO Preston Holloway turned his head slowly toward Gavin Thorne. His eyes were no longer cold, they burned with white-hot fury. Holloway realized in an instant that this was no longer a simple employment dispute. It was a catastrophic legal landmine involving corporate accounting fraud, SEC compliance violations, breach of fiduciary duty, and criminal forgery that would destroy the company's public reputation if brought to trial. "Did you create these files the day after Richard was terminated?" Holloway asked Gavin, his voice deathly quiet. Gavin swallowed hard, sweat glistening on his forehead as he fumbled for words. "Preston, look, we were trying to protect the executive bonus pool. I thought if we documented his management issues—" "Get out of this room right now," Holloway commanded, pointing a rigid finger toward the double doors. "Get your personal belongings and leave the premises immediately. Your employment with Apex Logistics is terminated for gross misconduct, effective this second. Gavin scrambled out of his chair, knocking over his glass of water, and practically sprinted out of the boardroom in absolute disgrace. The door slammed shut behind him, leaving Holloway, Sidney Shaw, Winston, and me alone in the quiet room. CO Preston Holloway sat in silence for a long moment, taking a deep breath and rubbing his temples before turning his full attention to me. Sidney Shaw started to speak, but Holloway raised a hand to silence her immediately. "Mr. Vance," Holloway said, his voice entirely devoid of its earlier corporate arrogance. "You spent 7 years building the operational backbone of this enterprise. And what occurred here was an egregious failure of leadership. You are not here to dismantle this company. You are here to receive what you rightfully earned." He gestured to Sidney Shaw to prepare a formal agreement. "We will honor Section 12B in full," Holloway stated clearly. "Apex Logistics will execute a direct wire transfer representing 10% of our $52,400,000 net profit for the third quarter, amounting to $5,240,000, into your designated account within 3 business days." I looked Preston Holloway straight in the eye and kept my voice perfectly composed. "That is an acceptable resolution for my contractual claim, Mr. Holloway," I replied firmly. "But before I sign any mutual release or non-disclosure agreement, I have 2 non-negotiable conditions that must be included in the settlement terms. Name them." Holloway responded without hesitation. "First, Dennis Miller must receive a full financial settlement of $250,000, categorized as a consulting severance. For his wrongful termination, I specified. Second, Laura Jenkins must receive an official, unreserved letter of recommendation signed personally by you, praising her executive leadership and operational excellence, ensuring her career progression remains entirely unblemished." Holloway looked at me thoughtfully, a flicker of genuine respect appearing in his eyes. "Done," he agreed, signing his initials onto the term sheet immediately. "Sidney will have the final formal documentation ready for execution by noon tomorrow." 3 business days later, at 9 o'clock in the morning, I sat at my study desk with my mother Helen, sitting comfortably in the armchair beside me. I refreshed my online banking portal. The screen updated, displaying a cleared wire transfer in the amount of $5,240,000. A clean, legal, untouchable sum that permanently transformed our lives. I did not shed tears of sorrow. Instead, a deep sense of peace washed over me. My very first action was logging into the hospital payment system and paying off my mother's medical care balances entirely, bringing her account to $0. Next, I wired the full payoff amount for her home mortgage and established a dedicated healthcare trust fund to ensure she would receive top-tier medical assistance for the rest of her life. That afternoon, I transferred the agreed $250,000 payout to Dennis Miller, who wept with gratitude over the phone, explaining that the funds would allow him to launch his independent financial consulting firm. Meanwhile, Laura Jenkins used her glowing executive recommendation from CEO Holloway to secure a promoted vice presidency position at a premier national logistics corporation. A month later, I purchased a beautiful, sunlit coastal home overlooking the Pacific Ocean in cash. As I sat on my spacious wooden deck, sipping a warm cup of coffee, while watching the morning waves crash against the shoreline, I took out my laptop and posted a measured, anonymous review on a prominent corporate employer rating platform. I wrote, "Be exceptionally cautious of sudden executive restructurings timed right before annual bonus distributions. True leadership honors legacy, respects legal contracts, and rewards dedication rather than hiding behind deceptive practices." Looking back on the entire ordeal, I smiled as the cool sea breeze brushed past my face. Gavin Thorne and his greedy associates believed they could ruthlessly discard a 56-year-old veteran employee to line their own pockets. But they failed to realize that every contract carries consequences. Every digital action leaves a trace. And when you try to cheat someone who knows the rules better than you do, the fine print will eventually bring your entire empire crashing down.